Alright, so obviously this isn't a video of planting beans. Last night had 3 tents come through, and I think they got even more of it north of here. So didn't get any field work done today. The sun didn't even come out today until dang near 2. Actually, I think it was after 2 o'clock when the sun finally came out. This morning it was still spitting rain and kind of overcast, so it didn't even begin to start drying out until just a few hours ago. So I don't know if we'll get a chance to spread this little fertilizer out tomorrow and get rid of it or not. I hope so, but we'll find out. It'll still be too wet to do any planting. But anyway, since I didn't get anything done field-wise today, I figured we'd throw up another Charles City video. This time around, we have the guy that we can thank for starting this whole ordeal, Al, who we have seen before. He's the one who gave us the site tour of the plant last year when I was out there, and he's been in several videos just this last trip. You'll see him over on the one side kind of commentating. So we've seen him before, but this is his first actual like sit down talk video that's his alone. He was another one that was only there for a few short years. He tried to get in early, but Vietnam kind of screwed it up for him. So he didn't get in until the early 70s, and then he was only there for about 3.5 years. But in his 3.5 years, he got to see and do a lot of stuff. He was a floor manager in a bunch of different departments, so he got to see and do a lot of things in that position. So without further ado, here's our friend Al.
Going yet?
I'm glad that I was able to host you, and I'm glad that you were able to meet as many people as you did on this trip. I hope it was worth your while, and from what I gathered, it was. My story for Oliver, or hearing of Oliver, was a neighbor of ours lived on a road that was a shortcut cross country down to the Oliver plant. And if you were on that road when work was done, 55 miles an hour was minimum speed. As they went by, gravel would disappear and go 30 feet into the road. That was the first time I heard Oliver mentioned, and sometimes it wasn't in the best of light. When I went to college, I had the junior year blues. I don't know, it might have been a little bit too much wine, women, and song, but anyway, I kind of hit a lull in my educational opportunity, and I thought, well, I'm just gonna quit college and find a job. I knew Uncle Sam was probably going to get me sooner or later. So, middle of the year, I decided I wasn't going to go back for the next semester. I went down to Charles City and applied at Charles City. Well, at that time, there was a bit of discrimination going on. And the discrimination involved what your draft status was. If you were 1A or going to be 1A and eligible for the draft, nobody wanted to touch you because they knew you were going to be gone in 6 months or so. So after a couple of weeks trying to find a job, I couldn't find a job, so I went back to college. I went for that semester, then I took a little trip out to California, worked at a machine shop out there, Schiffer Manufacturing. And Yeah, it kind of piqued my interest a little bit. It wasn't such a bad job. Came back, thought I was going to be drafted right away. Wasn't. Did some odd jobs, worked construction. Went in the Army, served my Vietnam time. Went back to college. Graduated from college, got married, and decided I had to find a place to live. And so I applied down to Charles City at White. They talked to me this time because I'd served my time. So talked to Mr. Byers, and he says, well, what are you looking for? I said, I don't know, what do you got? Well, he says, you college graduate. Yeah. Well, he says, we got one supervisor position open right now. And he said, I don't know whether you want it or not, but you can take a look. So I took a look, and it was in the foundry. And at that time, they didn't have all the best of air quality in there. So I kind of passed and said, well, what else you got open on the board? Well, he says, we got a technical writer position open. You want to take the test for that? I said, fine, I'll take the test. Well, I took the test, and they had about a 4-page booklet. And it was a time test. And they said, okay, find all the mistakes in this booklet. Well, if you want to read it really fast, you're going to miss something. Well, in order to do that, I couldn't read that fast and pick up all the semicolons and all the commas that were missed and that type of stuff. So I did okay, but I didn't do good enough. And he said, well, I got an office job for you. I said, well, what's that? He said, it's in production control. I says, well, what's that involved? Well, he says, you're basically going to be handling paper. When a new lot of tractors come down through, all the paperwork for all the machining operations are going to go through production control. And when it's time to do the machining on these pieces, all that paperwork has to be out there for that lot. So I said, well, yeah, I'll try that. So I worked at that for probably a year. And it was a job. It was basically pushing paper. That's all it was pushing paper. Well, then they changed the job description, so to speak. So they put, instead of being in the office, they put a production control person in each department or groups of departments. And I was sent out to 041, 042, 051, and 052, and that was basically in the cast iron machining department. And I sat down on the floor right by the turret lathes and some radial drills. And I don't know whether anybody's familiar with when you machine cast iron, especially in lathes, you can get a lot of tool noise, screeching and screaming. Well, I sat next to that for, I don't know, 4 months, 5 months. So my hearing on my right side of my body isn't as good as what it is on the left side. My significant other says it's not good on either side, but that's beside the point. So I was in that position, and when I was in that position, I was giving the paperwork to the operators to run the different pieces. And at that time, they were also went to a computerized system of using information off of the time cards to know where the position in the machining sequence. And you every 2 days you got this big old wide computer printout that was like that thick, and it had all the pieces that were in process down at white. And you could, supposedly, it was supposed to tell you where each piece and what process it was in. But that didn't always necessarily hold true, because when you're working piecework, lots of times you get a good job and run it, you'll get a bank, you'll have hours built up. And so sometimes we'd have gear cases that were still being made that had bull gears and pinion shafts in them on the assembly line already, because they had so much bank. So yes, it showed you where things were, but no, it wasn't a true picture. So as I was there longer and longer, I'd have to go to the foundry and find out if pieces were coming, or go try to find in this holding area where the pieces were that was needed, and then get a trucker and truck them back to the shop where they were being machined. Well, when you do this, you kind of tend to learn part numbers, the sequence of how things are done, and that type of thing. Well, this was probably in early '74 when they were going to start booting up production, and they knew they were going to need more supervisors. So I don't know, I must have shown that I had a little bit of aptitude for finding my way around different part numbers and this. And granted, I didn't have any machining experience to speak of, but my job was not really to know how to do everything, which sometimes in the past, a lot of the supervisors were brought up through the ranks, and they did know how to run a lot of the jobs. But my job was to make sure everything ran smoothly, do the paperwork involved, call engineering if we had a problem, work with quality control if we have a problem, that type of thing. Put out fires. If you had parts that were on a hot sheet, they came around with a hot sheet every night that they wanted to know where all the pieces and parts were, because they were needed the next day on the assembly line or whatever. So I was hired on temporarily as what they called a vacation replacement supervisor. And if they had any special projects, they kind of got thrown in the mix too. It was a really a good experience, because I got to be in a very diverse amount of departments and situations where, now I don't think a lot of people had that opportunity. My experience as far as a vacation replacement supervisor was that if someone was taking a week or 2 weeks vacation as a supervisor, I would come into the department Thursday morning or whenever the Thursday shift or started, whether it was first, second, or third shift. And I would shadow the supervisor Thursday and Friday, when they would be gone for the next week or 2 weeks. And I would work with the guys. As I told them, I said, you're the guys running the job. I'm here to help you if you need help. And that type of management philosophy did me well. Some of the more seasoned veterans, as far as supervisors, they tended to have quite an opposite type of philosophy. But it worked well for me, and I told them, I said, well, whatever goes around comes around. So I don't want to find out anything that you got me jacked around. So what goes around comes around. And I never had any problem with anybody. So some of the departments that I worked in was the sheet metal department, 083. 082 was the 100-ton press. 083 was sheet metal, 084 I believe was the welding part of the sheet metal area. I also worked as a supervisor in 041, 042, which was lathes and later chuckers. The hub broach, multiple drills, the wheel bullard, front and rear frame, gear case, machining. And one thing that, now I was kind of thinking about this, one thing that most people don't really think of, but is we had 2 washers in that department. And lots of times some of these parts, when they got done with being machined, they were just filthy dirty with chips and everything. And so at night, usually when there was 3 shifts on the washer, you'd have people hanging hydraulic cases, running them through the washer, blowing all the holes out, restacking them, sending them to the next machining operation, and then after it was all machined, get washed and put over into the hydraulic assembly area. And we also had a big washer that you put the front frames and the rear frames in, and you ran them through. And when they were through, they were just about at the assembly point. So they didn't have to be moved too far because they were pretty cumbersome to move. But that's one thing that I don't think people gave those people that hung all that stuff, washed all that stuff, and blew that stuff out, got enough credit for. Because there was a lot of handling. Granted, the heavier pieces were all hoist, but you still had to stand there and blow all holes and that. So anyway, right along with that, Department 052, 051 was the hydraulic housing machining. They had the hones that made the spool valves for the hydraulics. That pretty much there as far as that goes. Then I had some experience with the rear gear case assembly and supervising there. That was the beginning of the assembly line, and then their front frames got married up the way a ways. The hydropowers and the hydraulic housings were all assembled in a separate clean area away from the dirt and grime, because the way it was set up, all the cast iron machining was done within 60 feet of the assembly line. So we had all that cast iron in the air. You go home at night and you just go like that and it'd be cast iron dust on you. But I was on that as part of the assembly line. I supervised a little bit on allied equipment. I had a special project one time they needed, I think it was 2 or 3 278 backhoes, I do believe. And they assembled they looked in whatever pieces they didn't have. I had carte blanche to go and have them made wherever they needed to be made, or to get them so they could finish, because that was when they were phasing out the allied line. They had these orders and they wanted them off the books. So that was kind of interesting. I was looking for either 6 brake covers, the old style, the non-hydraulic ones, not kind of 1750s. Like, I couldn't figure out where I was going to get them, and they said, well, we don't have them in stores. Well, for a year, a whole bunch of chassis for they were painted yellow. I don't know where they were headed, but used that gear case, and I figured, I'll go get them. Well, I got out there and they weren't there. They were out towards the Cleveland building, and went out there and they'd all been scrapped. And they said, well, if they were scrapped and they had been sitting there, you couldn't have used them. And I looked at them. I said, well, if they're scrap, they're scrap. You can't take a piece off because of all the accounting problems that would be encountered. And I thought, you're worried about accounting problems, and I'm trying to get these tractors put together. But such as it was, they dug some up somewhere. They went over my head. I said, I can't put my hand on him here. But I also was on the main assembly line when we were really cranking the tractors out. They were running over 100 550s. I don't know, probably 65 to 70 small frames, 1555s, 1655s, and just a few less of the 1755, 1855, 1955, 2255, 1355, but things were going full bore. They started making the 4150 at about that time. I was in on some of the final prep of the first one they put together, as far as sheet metal went. I was just kind of following around like a puppy dog, because Pud Springer and Vern Griman, that name's come up before, were scratching their heads and trying to figure out how in God's green earth they were going to bend this throttle rod to go from the throttle down to the injection pump. I don't know did they ever do the rod or whether they used a cable.
It's a rod. And then they went with two different rods. There was a small one that kept bending, and then there was a bigger one.
Okay.
That
But
came later.
there was a lot of head scratching on how you're going to set up a jig to bend that sucker how it needed to be bent. So I was in on that a little bit. They also put up a $1 million building at that time to do assembly on the 4150s and 4180s. And it was a different type of assembly, and it's the type of assembly that's used now. You started out with a dolly, and you just pushed it around inside this building. And because they weren't high volume tractors, you had a station, and then you built on that station, and then it moved down to the next station, to the next group of workers. There wasn't one worker right after another worker, right after another worker. And I had the privilege of being in that building too. There was an incident after I had gone through this. They gave me they assigned me second shift in 041, 042 as a supervisor. And we came in one day, and the guy says, well, when you get time, you take a look, all the activity going on over there on the main assembly line. They had a big fire today. I said, oh, really? Yeah. So during one of my lulls between putting fires out, why, I looked over there, and what had happened in the area below the assembly line, even when I was on the assembly line, we had these automatic guns that put 80, 90 in the rear ends and put the hydraulic fluid in the top case, and every once in a while it would malfunction, they wouldn't shut off, so oil would run down underneath. Well, M&R was over working, this is a story I heard, story from 50 years ago, that they were doing some welding underneath there, and a spark ignited that oil that was underneath the assembly line, and it was right by the ovens. And they have exhaust fans by the heat booth in the oven. You run through the paint booth, spray, and then they got the exhaust fans that exhaust the fumes, and then it goes through the oven that cures the paint. Well, anyway, with those fans running, it was just like a tornado underneath there, burning all that oil up. And it took the, I don't know whether they were 4x4 rails that the assembly line slid on, but it got that stuff hot enough that it warped and bent. All these rails got red hot and everything sagged down in. And so they had tractors that were painted, ready to have wheels and tires put on, that were in the paint booth, in the oven, sunk down, and they had to extract all those tractors out of there before they could get down in there to fix the stuff. But much to the credit of maintenance and repair, the assembly line was back up and running in 2 days, which was, I thought, quite a task that they accomplished. But yeah, and it was quite an experience. I wasn't there that long. I started in like 1st October in '72, and in 1974 my dad passed away, and so I was farming the home place and working at White, and working second shift was not real conducive to getting much stuff done. But by the time you got up in the morning and had to leave for work, and as a supervisor you had to be there generally half an hour earlier, and you had to stay a half an hour later, and it was kind of burning the candle at both ends, as you know, Ethan, because you're doing it and still doing it, but it makes a man out of you, I guess. So they say. So that, and my brother got out of the Army then, and they were getting ready. There was a shutdown, and from Thanksgiving to Christmas in '75, which was kind of a precursor to a lot of stuff that was coming on later. And they were slowing production down, and they were laying some people off. And it got to be springtime, and my brother and I had rented some more land, and we decided that maybe I'd just quit my job and we'd head off and start farming. So got to be April of '76, I turned in my resignation. So I wasn't there only 3.5 years, something like that. But I figured that during those 3.5 years, I had a lot of experiences that people that had been there 10 or 15 years had never had. So the people I worked with were great. Oh, sure, once in a while you have a problem, but I only had to fire one guy, and the reason that he got fired is because he was starting up his construction, dirt moving, Caterpillar waterway making business, and he bought a cat, and he wanted to work on the rails and the grousers and all that and get it ready to go for the spring. So he just took off one night and didn't tell anybody he was gone. So he got fired, but he didn't care. So it wasn't fired because of anything he did per se, other than just walking out and not telling anybody. As I've been sitting here listening to a lot of other people who talk about the ups and the downs of White and the problems that it causes because you get shifted back and forth between different classes that you hold, and you keep getting bumped down and bumped down and bumped down as somebody senior bumps you down. That causes trouble inside, and a lot of most of the supervisors were brought up through the ranks, and we had one gentleman who they were saying when they were thinning the herd, so to speak, on getting rid of people on different shifts as far as supervisors because there weren't as many people there. He talked to me one night and he said, you know what, Al? He says, I'm 63 years old. Or close, well, I wouldn't say 63. He was in his early 60s. He says, they're going to put me back on a machine. He says, it's going to kill me. I says, well, I says, you know, I think somebody's looking out for you because I says, I'm going to turn in my resignation in the spring. So probably there might be a slot for you. And I never seen such a relief on a man's face in my life. It was just like he was given a new lease on life. So that made me feel good because my leaving really helped somebody out. And that basically gives you a thumbnail. There were incidents, stories to be told, but I was there just during the transition from the 1955 to the 2135, 2155, 180, I believe, something like that. That we're using that newer gear case, and things were all messed up because they were putting machine centers in to do all the machining on the rear gear cases. I think they put 2 centers in to do the rear gear cases, if I'm not mistaken. And so you could make a gear case with one guy, well, 2 guys. One guy to mill it and dow pin it, and then the other guy to put it in the machine, and it does all the XYZ axis movements and all that. Tooling changes and you name it, it did it. So they did invest some money in the switchover to that newer tractor, but the production capability per day couldn't match anything like the old assembly line production. Somebody has a name for it. It's Barnes. Is it Barnes line? Anyway, it was designed by this company, and they used all their machines to do all the operations. Some of the operations, a number of different operations, like in some of the hydraulic housings, you have like 43 different steps to go through to make a hydraulic housing. So a lot of those pieces weren't real easy to produce. One of the things that I think has come up a time or two is a lot of the tooling. The tooling for the rear gear cases and the machines, I think it was set up for the 1800s, 1600s and 1800s. So you're getting back there ways, going from what, 1960, 61 for the 18s, something on that order, to 72, 74. A lot of stuff had gone through those machines and down that line. Sometimes some of these machines that were being used were used to make, I think, artillery mounts during World War II, and also I think they made gear cases for some vehicle, whether it was a half-track or something on that order, were also made in Charles City. But some of those machines were still being used. Now, you also have to give credit to maintenance repair for keeping everything running down there, because the building that the assembly line was in, people always said that even though they had that new assembly line all bought and paid for, but it never got moved to Charles City, I personally could see why you didn't want to move it to Charles City, because that building was probably built in the 1930s. It was very inefficient in the summer. It got really hot because there was no ventilation in there. In the wintertime, it was cold because there was no insulation. It was just bare roof on the top. So yes, it was a shame to see the assembly go to Coldwater, I believe. But if you look at it pragmatically, it was something that needed to be done. It would have been nice if they would have invested more money in the facility there. But in retrospect, you look at what happened to Minneapolis-Moline up at Hopkins, Minnesota. They were in the same situation basically that the White or Oliver, whatever you want to call it, was in. They didn't have any room for expansion. Hopkins was encircled by residential areas, so they couldn't grow up there. And basically, the Charles City plant was built between some railroad tracks, and it was long and skinny. You needed the railroad tracks to service, between the scrap metal for the foundry, the sand for the foundry, and lime for the foundry. That was all shipped in by rail. So yes, you needed the railroad tracks, but yes, they also constricted the access or the ability to expand. So I could see when I was there that what White was doing to Oliver, per se, was using it as a cash cow, and they were investing in what they thought was going to be the savior, but ended up being the downfall of not just one, but two companies. So I am not a crystal ball gazer, but I could see what was coming down the road, and I really didn't want to be a real integral part of it and investing a lot of time in a company that probably was gonna not survive as well as it could have. But that probably is pretty much my short story of short time that I was at Oliver / White Farm Equipment. So there you go.